Hello everyone, this is Robert with Team Copperhead, and in this video we're going to be talking about the Copperhead and Mammoth fight. Of course, this video is going to contain all sorts of spoilers, so go ahead and watch that fight first, come back, and we'll get into the discussion. So there's a fair amount to talk about in this video, so I'm going to kind of follow the standard flow that I always do with, what our thoughts were going into the fight, and then we're going to talk about some fun things like judges' decisions and BattleBot's rules and things like that, so stay tuned. Fun fact, I have been kind of dreading making this video ever since the second that the decision for this match came in, because I knew I'd have to talk about this, discuss it, and just kind of reopen that wound. So anyway, let's talk about kind of what our thoughts were going into the fight. We felt pretty good being that we were a number 3 seed. That is awesome. We were doing really well in the rest of the competition. So going into this fight, you kind of always have to assume that you're going to get a weird matchup. It just kind of always works out like that. And Mammoth is a weird matchup. It is the smallest bot in the competition versus the largest bot in the competition. In terms of strategy, there's no real strategy with Mammoth. It's just a big, unwieldy bot, so we knew that we were going to have to be driving around a lot. If another bot is small, about the same size as you, getting around to them is just boop, like that. But with a big bot, getting around to them is like that. So we knew that drive was going to be important. We decided to not really rely on the magnets. We didn't add the magnets for this fight because we were worried that it would stress the drivetrain a little bit too much. And we were kind of happy with where everything was from the Black Dragon fight. So real strategy, we just kind of did the standard configuration. We didn't do the cross member up front. We didn't do the magnets, and we just went with the standard top plate. We were using the same chassis that we were using previously, and everything was looking good going into the fight. So now we need to talk about the Mammoth, the elephant in the room, which is the drum. Why was the drum not spinning for a good, minute in the middle of the fight? Well, to understand this, we need to talk about how our weapon system was functioning this year. If you remember back to the overview video, which you should have watched, I mentioned that we were using HFI, which is high frequency injection. It is a feature of the VESC speed controller that injects a high frequency signal into the motor and ultimately uses that to determine the position of where the motor is, so that when you're at a dead stop and you say, give me, full drum, it can actually tell where that drum is and you can get a better startup. Very simplified, but that's what happens. HFI is engaged when the drum is at 0 RPM or very low RPM. It's all the way down at the bottom end of the range when it's basically not moving.
Oh, that's all?
21 horsepower.
Yeah, okay.
Once it starts moving, I think once it gets up to, let's just randomly call it 50 or 100 RPM, once it kind of starts going, it switches out of HFI and then it moves over to the other mode and then it spins and everything is good. So HFI is really only active during that little bit where it's just trying to get the drum spinning, and then when it's spinning, it turns off and then it's switched over to something else. So what was happening during this fight, we suspect, is that we just got a little rattled, got a little frazzled, and HFI was not able to engage, if that makes sense. So when the weapon motor is going, it's in some other mode, and then when it stops or slows down, it was having an issue transitioning back into HFI, and then the controller was not going all the way down, waiting for HFI to kick in and then go back up. We were just kind of maybe going down and going right back up, just a little frazzled with, Mammoth kind of being big and being awkward. So we suspect that's what was happening. The battery level at the end of the match didn't really indicate that we were having any issues with any mechanical problems. The ESCs seemingly weren't overheating. I know Luke on our team was saying that maybe the ESCs were overheating. We really don't know. We weren't measuring temperature during the fight. Maybe that's something that we got to do next year. But my best guess on this is that we just weren't allowing the HFI to kick in when the drum stopped. It wasn't transitioning over to HFI, and then we were having the cogging issues. And there was definitely several times during the match where you could see the drum just kind of twitching a little bit. That is exactly what happens when HFI is not enabled. It just can't grab the position of the motor to know which way to spin it up to actually get it going. So most likely it was something to do with HFI just not transitioning out of the other mode it was in, transitioning to HFI, and then transitioning back. So that is what the issue was. And towards the end of the match, you saw that we just took a second when we were upside down, the drum got going, and then we flipped upside down or right side up again, and then everything was fine after that. So there was no physical damage done. There was no electrical issues. It was just a matter of that new HFI firmware just kind of not really working the way we thought it was. And if you look back to the Black Dragon fight, there was a time where the weapon was down for a little bit too. We suspect that this was the same. Also, HFI, we're not really sure, but it actually might interact differently depending on the heat of the motor and the heat of the controller. Theoretically, if things are heating up, it might not function as well. So that is our suspicions as to why the weapon motor and the weapon drum was not going during the middle portion of the fight. So now that we've discussed the drum issue and what we suspect was happening, it's time to move on to the really fun and controversial parts of this video, which is the judge's decision and judging criteria and all of that good stuff. Spoiler alert, I am on Team Copperhead, and of course I'm going to be biased towards Team Copperhead. And, you know, let's be honest, I thought we should have won. Before we get into all of that discussion, I do want to have a little bit of a disclaimer here. I am in no way implying that Mammoth shouldn't have won, and I'm not saying anything against Mammoth. I think every time you let this go to the judge's decision, you've already lost, and it's just a game of chance at that point. It was a split decision. I think that just by definition says that this was a controversial decision, or not everyone was unanimous in the decision, right? So going into this, I don't want anyone, especially Team Mammoth, to think or imply that I'm saying that they shouldn't have won and that was wrong. I don't want to imply that the judges were wrong in their decisions. It was our fight to lose, and we lost it. We did not do enough to prove that we won. We could have gotten a knockout. We could have absolutely dominated them. We did not do those things, therefore we lost the fight. The following discussion that I'm going to have is just kind of an argument into the rules. I've got the rules right here, my interpretation of them, and just opening up that discussion because I think it's warranted anytime there is a split decision that is relatively close. So all of that being said, get ready to comment down below on your keyboard, and let's talk about the judge's decision and the judging criteria. So here is the fun part of the video. Let's talk about judging criteria. I've linked to the actual judging rule set for BattleBots down below. This is the judge's guide for BattleBots 2020, so this is the exact rule set that they should be using. You've got 3 different criteria. You've basically got damage worth 5 points, you've got control worth 3 points, and you've got aggression worth 3 points. Let's start with control. Control is basically how much you are in control of the fight, how much you are not the aggressor, that's where these things get kind of weird, how much you are controlling the fight. An argument could be made that this not an argument, it should have gone to Mammoth for control. I'm not going to argue that point at all. I 100% agree that Mammoth was the more in control bot of this fight. I could have some argument about Copperhead getting 0 points in control, and I'll kind of get into that later. The problem with these 3 categories is if you're going to damage the other team, and you do that, how can you have absolutely 0 control when doing so? And how can you have absolutely 0 aggression when doing so? Were you literally just sitting there and the other bot ran into you? Well, that's actually not the case because it needs to be deliberate and intentional. We'll get into that later. But the control category, you could definitely argue that Mammoth got the vast majority of those points, maybe all of them. Let's just say they got all of them. Then you get into the aggression category. If you watch the first 30 seconds of this fight only, I think you would absolutely give all aggression to Copperhead. I think this is a very split one, and depending on who you're rooting for and how you see the fight, I think this could go either way. There are many times where Mammoth is just simply in the middle of the arena, just kind of trying to face us while we're circling. I'm not really sure if either of us are aggressive at that point. The aggression comes from basically intentionally attacking the other robot. And there are many times where Copperhead was driving directly into the underside of Mammoth, and I think that showed aggression. So at the very, very least, I don't think it's fair to give Copperhead 0 points for aggression. I think at the very least we deserve 1, possibly 2 points, just kind of depending on your lens and how you see it. So this is where this gets a little bit muddy. I don't necessarily think it's fair to give Copperhead absolutely 0 points for control. We did have moments of control, but Mammoth was definitely more in control, I think, for the majority of the fight. And then aggression, it's really a toss-up depending on who you like and how you viewed the fight. Some people are definitely going to see it that Mammoth was more aggressive. Some people are going to view it that Copperhead was more aggressive. So those two categories are kind of variable. Now let's talk about damage. So now we get to talk about the most important category, which is damage. Damage is 5 points, and this is definitely going to swing it. If Copperhead gets 1 or 2 points in the combined other categories, it really is going to come down to damage as to who won the fight. We were told after this fight ended that the perception was that when our weapon went down during that middle point of the fight, that was seen as damage points against us, or damage points in favor of Mammoth. I have the BattleBots rules right here, and I'm reading from the rules. Damage means that through deliberate and controlled action, a BattleBot either directly or indirectly by using the arena hazards reduces the functionality, effectiveness, or defensibility of an opponent. It is not considered damage if an opponent, it's worded weird, if an opponent's BattleBot inadvertently harms themselves. So I think this is really interesting. If you go back and watch the fight, our weapon is working, and then the weapon isn't working, right? You have 2 distinct points. There is some area between that to where the weapon is and isn't working. If you can find a frame that shows Mammoth doing something deliberate, because it has to be a deliberate controlled action, if Mammoth is doing a deliberate controlled action, I would like to see that, but there was no deliberate controlled action that caused that weapon to stop. It goes on to say that if an opponent BattleBot inadvertently harms themselves, it is not considered damage. So let's say we burned out our electronics. Let's say we weren't controlling them properly. We misprogrammed them with VESC, things like that. By the BattleBots rules, that cannot be seen as damage from the other opponent. This is considered self-inflicted, and later on it actually goes to talk about how this kind of almost goes into the cosmetic category, which is kind of strange. But there was, in my opinion, no deliberate controlled action from Mammoth that created any damage on us. Now, they did on several occasions flip us over, flip us upside down, but they did not ever do so in a manner that our weapon drum, ate into the floor and that caused any damage, nothing like that. Our weapon configuration is kind of set up so that doesn't really happen when we're, I don't know, if this is Copperhead and here's the drum, when we're up like that, the weapon doesn't hit. When we're on our side, the wheel's kind of protected and that side protects it. And when we're upside down, we have those forks that stick up top. So it's actually really difficult to flip us upside down and actually get the weapon to dig into the floor. And if you watch the fight, that never really happened. The other thing that I find interesting is, this is from later on in the document, the best way to judge damage is to observe how the bot functions after the damage occurs. Now this is interesting because, as I kind of said earlier, there's no inciting moment that the weapon goes from working to not working. There's no moment. Mammoth kind of rides up on us, the weapon stops after a hit, and they kind of ride up on it, and that's something that we can't start the weapon because they're just kind of on top of it. We separate, and then the weapon just kind of never starts again for us. So there really wasn't a big hit. There really wasn't anything that caused it to stop. So then you have to look at it, observe how the bot functions after the damage occurs. There was no real damage event. Towards the end of the match, we do regain control of that weapon. So one could argue, once again, one could argue that there was no events that caused the weapon to stop. It was just a temporary lapse in the weapon functioning, which goes into the self-inflicted category. So I think this gets really interesting. There's a lot of definitions in here. I highly recommend everyone look through this because it is interesting. They do talk about cosmetic, they do talk about ablative, things like that, functional damage, drive damage is more important than weapon damage, things like that. And if you do watch towards the end of the match, Mammoth does have several pieces that have been removed from it. The weapon wheel, or the wheel hub has been dented. The wheel is kind of wobbling. There is specifically a part about that, about the wheel being somehow damaged in a way that causes it to not act properly, which did happen, and that was a direct hit that you can see our drum doing against their wheel. There's also a couple pieces removed against the wheel guard. So in my mind, based on the judging criteria, we should have got all the damage points. I can tell you, I mean, you know, it's me telling you after the fact, there was absolutely zero damage to Copperhead. After the match, we put the bot in the weapon test thing and spun it up. There was no damage. We did go on to fight in some number of bounty episodes, and we used the exact bot in the exact configuration with all of the hardware. Everything functioned perfectly fine. I am trying to find some sort of case where Mammoth did some damage to us with their primary weapon, or otherwise that was considered deliberate and controlled action. I can't find it in anywhere in this fight. I could argue, once again, I could argue that Mammoth deserved 0 damage points. There was no deliberate damage caused to Copperhead during this fight. If the drum was something that was damaged, which I'm making the case it wasn't damaged because it was the HFI situation, if it was damaged, that is self-inflicted, and that can't be attributed to the other team. So in that case, we would either get 4 or 5 points, and that generally always puts the fight in our favor according to the judging criteria. So that is my argument that I am proposing. In the next section, what I want to talk about is 2 little tweaks to the judging criteria that could actually help fix this for future fights. So one last final thing before we talk about, you know, the quote-unquote improvements that I'm suggesting is I do want to talk a little bit about cosmetic damage, a blade of armor, things like that. At the end of the fight, Mammoth mentioned that the bits that we tore off were, you know, meant to do that, and, you know, oh, they're meant to do that, and it's cosmetic, whatever. And this is something that I have a little bit issue with. Once again, not an issue with Mammoth, but an issue with how the rules are written and how they are to be interpreted. I don't know if you have to paint them a certain color. If they're like safety yellow, maybe Hypershock would be screwed by this, but if they're a certain color, maybe those are considered cosmetic, something like that. A couple of the pieces that were removed from Mammoth were those little 2 white forks up in the middle, you know, the big frame there, the white forks. I'll probably have a video showing those. Those were removed and or damaged. And I'm gonna pose a question to Mammoth. Did you guys put those there randomly? Are they just, you know, randomly there for decoration, or do those serve a purpose? Because in my mind, you have those right by your gearboxes and right by your drive motors. I would make an argument that those do serve a purpose. And by the definition of cosmetic damage, blah, 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 do not reduce the functionality or functionality, effectiveness, or defensibility of the bot. So I would like to know from Mammoth if those pieces that we removed have no function whatsoever, because in my mind, where they're located, the fact that they're made out of metal, they absolutely do have some function. And if they do have some function, by the definitions, they cannot be considered cosmetic damage. Therefore, that once again counts into the damage. So I am not trying to start a fight. I'm not trying to, you know, call anyone out. I am just simply making a discussion and an argument the way I see it. I don't see that as a cosmetic damage if it is a piece of the bot that has some sort of function or purpose. So after the fight was over, Greg Munson came up to us and said, hey, if you guys can think of any way to improve the rules so that, you know, things are more fair and more consistent, let me know. Well, Greg, I'm officially letting you know I've thought about this pretty much all season. Ever since this fight happened, I haven't been able to sleep. Just kidding. I thought of 2 simple little ways that we could mitigate some of these issues from happening. I think absolutely 100% if it goes to a judge's decision, those judges need to view the damage. I think without doing that, you're doing a disservice, because from the judge's position, you really can't get up on the bots and see what damage was caused. Copperhead had 0 visible damage whatsoever, other than scrapes and scuffs and things like that, which is purely cosmetic, and you guys don't consider that damage. Mammoth absolutely had a bent tire. They had a couple pieces removed. Whether or not, you know, we're calling that cosmetic or not, that is, you know, a discussion for the rules. But I think a visual inspection is always warranted when it goes to a judge's decision. Secondly, before that, I think a function test should be required when it goes to judge's decision. If there is not a knockout and it lasts 3 minutes, I think both bots should be separated and they should be asked to demonstrate drive and demonstrate active weapon. I think that is absolutely critical. If we could have demonstrated that our weapon got up to speed and we had both drive, I think that maybe could have changed the minds of the judges because they were attributing Mammoth to damaging Copperhead's weapon in some way. And I don't think anyone that's a builder can say, oh, it got damaged, but then it just got fixed. Did they damage the belt and then the belt self-healed? You know, did the ESC blow up and then repair itself? I don't know if temporarily overheating or temporarily just being in a weird state in the firmware, I don't think those things can be really considered damage. And it's absolutely not considered damage by the rules of BattleBots. So I am proposing that there is always a visual inspection and always a function test whenever it goes to 3 minutes. We are getting more and more judges' decisions in this show, and I don't think that we can rely on the judges, which are just human beings. I don't think you can rely on them to look 30 feet across the box and say, yeah, I think I have a good idea of what the damage looks like. I just don't think that's reasonable. Also, I don't think that there are some fights that end with one bot maybe kind of secretly hiding a crab walk. I think we need to stop the fight after it's over and say, okay, who can drive and whose weapon works? And that is the definitive way to test how much damage was done and what condition the bots are in at the end of the match. So this ended up being a lot longer video than I thought it was, but there's a lot of stuff to cover in here. So I'll say it once again, I said it throughout the video. Mammoth, nothing against you guys. You did fantastic. You had a great season. You have a great bot. You're a great team. You're great people. All of that. Also the judges, nothing against you guys. I'm not calling anyone out. I'm not blaming the judges. I think anytime there's a split decision, it doesn't point to the judges. It points to the rule set. It points to the judging criteria. If the judging criteria was absolutely perfect, there is no way that there could ever be a split decision because it would completely remove any kind of bias or any kind of decision-making skills from the judges. So anytime we see a split decision, it just points to the fact that there is some room for interpretation. So just something to think about. And my proposal of having some sort of function test and also a visual inspection, I think could help mitigate some of those issues. So that's all I'm proposing in this video. I'm not trying to be like super salty and say, oh, we should have won and Mammoth should have never gotten it. Absolutely not. Please do not interpret it that way. Anyway, that is the end of this fight recap. Thank you for sticking through. We do have possibly some more fights coming up in the Bounty Hunter series, so be on the lookout for that. I'll be having some more fight recaps on that. Thanks for watching. Check us out on our Facebook pages and see you in the next video.